Hey everybody, and welcome to a very quick run through of week 1 and week 2, but I also want to touch on week 3. So what I mostly want to focus on in this video is kind of summing up what we've looked at so far, and also looking at what we're going to be talking about this week and a little bit of the week after that. So mostly what I really want to do is look at the discussions. So just to give you an idea, I did provide feedback for people on their discussions whenever I graded those, but I wanted to take just a quick second to kind of summarize kind of the thoughts about those discussions. So let's look at chapter number 1. So in chapter number 1, that was really easy, right? You just had to talk a little bit about yourself. I don't know if you got a chance, some of those of you that came into the class really early and already did your discussion, you may not have seen the last half of the class, who commented. And I think you should, because it's really interesting seeing kind of all of our backgrounds, where we're from, people that don't go to Westfield, people that don't live in Massachusetts, people who are traditional students, people who are non-traditional students, people who have kids, people who don't have kids, people who have interesting jobs, people who have not so interesting jobs. So there's lots of cool variety for you to check out in there. You may have some things in common with some of your classmates that you didn't know previously. Alright, so chapter 2 is really where we get started. So chapter 2 is where we start talking about how we study the brain. And so we talked a lot about lesions and phrenology and things like that. And so in this discussion, what I'm looking for is you to pick out a neuroimaging technique or a neuroscience method and choose basically or a question about behavior, and then choose what you would use to study that. So for example, let's say that I was interested in face recognition. And this is something that we see, right? Like later in the coming chapters. So face recognition, how would we do that? Well, you could say that you were interested in using EEG. And if you're going to say EEG, that's not an incorrect answer, but you just have to defend it. So if you were to say that you're interested in EEG because you're interested in brain activation across the whole brain, especially the surface of the brain in real time, then sure, that sounds great. But if you wanted to say that you wanted to use PET, so positron emission tomography, and you were interested in using that because it looks at the whole brain and is interested in neurotransmitters, that's good. You just still have to defend your argument. So really what I'm interested in here is mostly kind of how you defend what method you choose and why not the other methods. So what is it about the one that you would use compared to the others? Alright, so chapter number 3, this is the chapter that was all about visual perception, kind of the very rudimentary things here, and this is the discussion that does a little bit of variety in people's experiences here, because depending on your computer, you may not have been able to download your own data, and if you did download your own data, you'll see that the spreadsheet is very messy, and you may not know how to interpret it. But basically, what this task was is a go, no-go task. It is a very common type of behavioral task that's used a lot in cognitive psychology, and it's used a lot in cognitive psychology, especially when we are looking at differences among populations. And what I mean by that is looking at differences in people, let's say with ADD or ADHD versus people without ADHD, or looking at people with dyslexia versus without dyslexia, or people with symptoms of schizophrenia without symptoms of schizophrenia, things like that. Because what we can find is that if people's results vary systematically across these populations, then we might assume that something about that diagnosis or whatever that spectrum is might have some impact on those symptoms. So, for example, in the go no-go task, I ask here, what is this measuring? Because a lot of times people will say that this is kind of a measure of visual perception, but almost all of you pointed out that it's not just visual perception, that it also includes other things like impulse control or response inhibition or attention, and all of those are great answers. And so the question is, whenever you're doing this, what kinds of behavior are actually being measured here? So, for example, and so like one of the things that we do commonly find here is that people with schizophrenia tend to not do so well on a go, no-go task. They have trouble inhibiting responses sometimes, or initiating responses, depending on the symptoms. And so there, is it that there's a difference in people with schizophrenia in the way they perceive the world? Maybe. Is it due to their visual perception? Probably not. Probably has more to do with this impulse control and response inhibition. Alright, so that's the Chapter 3 stuff. Chapter 4, this is the one with the face memory test. You may remember that, right? So you had to try to recall those things. Now, the reason why I assigned this particular test is not only because I thought it was kind of fun and interesting, but also because I think that whenever we have to memorize faces like this, we start using a different strategy for doing this and how we normally perceive faces. One of the things that this chapter talks about when we talk about face processing is how we process faces holistically. In other words, when we look at a face, we perceive kind of the whole thing. Usually, most people, not everybody, but most people perceive the whole thing all together. But what happens is whenever we are trying our best to remember a lot of different faces, we will go and look for individual features. So we start perceiving those faces, or at least trying to perceive those faces, differently than we would normally in everyday life. And so I saw it a lot in your discussions. A lot of you mentioned how you started focusing on birthmarks, or on moles, or on sideburns, or eyebrows, and things like that. That's very different than how we normally perceive people's faces in the real world. And then the last chapter of this unit was the Stroop test. And so the Stroop test is very popular. It's been around since the 30s. So it's actually been around before cognitive psychology was even a thing. The Stroop test has. And what it does, you may remember, is it shows different colors or different colored words, and you have to try to say what the color of the word is, but not what the word itself is. And so usually almost everybody that I saw had different times for their tests. They took longer when they were incongruent. So whenever the color of the font and the actual word, what it was saying, competed with one another. So can we generalize this to normal everyday findings or everyday behaviors? That's really up to your interpretation. I saw a lot of creative ideas here. Some people talking about advertising and things like that, which is really interesting. But really what and so some people say yes, some people say no. And I'm not going to argue with either one of those, because in some cases I can see how this is relevant to at least the Stroop test to real world circumstances. But I can also see how some of you pointed out that this is not something that we typically see all that much in the real world, right? Font that is a different color than what the word says, and whenever that happens, is it really that big a deal? So what is it good for multitasking? I think that what this test shows is our ability to inhibit automatic behaviors. And this is one of the things that the chapter talks about, and the lecture video talks about a little bit, is that the reason why the Stroop test is interesting is because a lot of us can't help but have slower reaction times. Why is that? Because we can't stop reading. Whenever we see that word, we know that it's not relevant. We know that the word itself is not relevant, that we don't need to think about what the word says, and yet we can't help ourselves. And that's what causes us to be slower in naming the color of the word. Alright, now a quick preview of the week 3 discussions. So the chapter 6 discussion, this one is basically going to look at the forgetting curve, which is the first video here. And so you can do this either before or after you watch that video, but you do need a little bit of time. So give yourself 20 minutes of free time to do this. So if you want to, you can go ahead and open this up and try the list recall, try to study those words, and then watch one of these videos, which is about 15 minutes, then come back and then try test 2, and then compare your results, see how well you did, and then answer these couple of questions about that particular thing. Chapter 7 is all about, let me backtrack. So chapter 6 is all about kind of the structure of memory. So we're going to be talking a lot about sensory memory and change blindness, short-term memory, long-term memory, things like that. The next chapter is more applied. It's kind of how do we apply these things about memory now. So here we are going to do the human benchmark test, and the way to access this in case you're missing it. So here it automatically goes to the reaction time test. The one that we want is going to be the number memory and the visual memory. It doesn't matter which one you do first, but you click this little drop down, you can go to number memory, and then take the test right here. And you can kind of see the average user, what their particular results are. This is kind of interesting, right? Because this distribution shows us that some users are getting 1 point on this, which probably means that they're not actually trying, but most people seem to get about 8 to 9 points. And so, one thing to be thinking about, which I don't think that I actually ask as I don't ask it necessarily as a prompt here, but if you think about it, it seems like most people are remembering between 7 and 9 digits. Does that sound like anything we've talked about, maybe in chapter 1? And then again, with verbal memory, and see, verbal memory, very different. And we'll talk about why that is. Alright, so that's chapter 7, and then chapter 8 is a discussion that I hope that you are going to combine everything from the previous 2 chapters to answer, because it is deceptively straightforward. What I want you to do is to, based on chapters 6, 7, and 8, come up with 3 different strategies that you could use to enhance your own study habits. So what that means is, like, just for example, you can use this if you want to, but chunking is something that is talked about in these chapters. So if you think that chunking could help you in your study habits, then just explain why, how that works, and use the terminology from our book and from our lectures to explain why those things would benefit you in your studies. So in the past, I've seen people say 3 strategies. I would use short-term memory, and I would use sensory memory. That's not exactly what we're looking at, because those are structures. Those aren't actual mechanisms or strategies or abilities. Okay, so that's pretty much it. The other thing that I'll touch a little bit on is the research articles. The research articles for this week is Baylock and Carr, which is all about how pressure influences people's working memory, or their short-term memory, however you want to phrase it. But how things like pressure in the classroom, so stress and the pressure to do well and to succeed, how that might impact test-taking scores, and the findings there may not be exactly what you would expect. So give that one a look, as I think is very kind of very relevant to a lot of our college experiences. Alright, so I rambled on long enough. Thanks for hanging in there, and I'll see you in the discussion forums. Bye.